Welcome to a brief video on how to solve polynomial and rational inequalities. Our first problem, x minus 5 squared times x plus 2 must be less than 0. Two numbers multiplied together can only be less than 0 if one of them is negative. What we need to do is we need to find the zeros of my problem. The 0 for x minus 5 squared is positive 5, and the 0 for x plus 2 is negative 2. You've now found your zeros. In order to check to see which areas of our number line, for lack of a better term, will yield things that are less than 0 or negative answers, I need to check ranges, just like we did when we were graphing our rational inequalities, or our rational functions. So I'm going to pick negative 3, 0, and 6. It's fine to check 0 with these because we're not plotting points, we're just checking ranges. Plug negative 3 into the first parentheses. Negative 3 minus 5 yields a negative number, but when I square it, I get a positive. Negative 3 plugged into the second parentheses, negative 3 plus 2 yields a negative. And when I multiply that positive and that negative together, I get a negative. Next, I need to check 0. If I plug 0 into this parentheses, I get 0 minus 5, or negative 5 squared, is 25. That's a positive. If I plug 0 in here, 0 plus 2 is 2, or another positive, and that gives me a positive. Lastly, plugging 6 into my first parentheses gives me 6 minus 5, or 1 squared, or a positive, and 6 plugged into this parentheses gives me 8, or another positive. And multiplying two positives together gives me a positive answer. Now we're looking for negative answers. So the area that produced the negative will be my solution. That area represents negative 6 and everything, negative 2, excuse me, and everything less than negative 2. Anything between 2 and 5 gave me a positive, and anything greater than 5 gave me a positive as well. I want a negative. So anything smaller than negative 2 gives me a negative answer. As we all know, interval notation needs parentheses with negative infinity. And then I have to decide whether to use a bracket or a parentheses with negative 2. My problem says less than 0. Not less than or equal to 0, but less than 0. If 2 is in my solution set, then, if negative 2 is in my solution set, then negative 2 would be plugged into the x plus 2 parentheses, yielding 0. And 0 times anything equals 0. We do not have an equal in my problem. I need a parentheses. Our next problem is a rational function in which we have a variable in the denominator, x minus 1 times x plus 1 over x is less than or equal to 0. First, find the zeros of your numerator, 1 and negative 1, and then find the zeros of your denominator. That'll be 0. Again, you want to pick values on the outside and in between, and test them and find out whether the solutions give you positives or negatives. Plugging negative 2 in here yields a negative. Plugging negative 2 right there also gives me a negative, and plugging a negative in my denominator gives me yet another negative. 3 negatives give me a negative. Plugging negative 0.5 in here gives me a negative. Negative 0.5 right there gives me a positive, because a negative half plus a positive 1 is a positive. That yields a positive. And negative 0.5 down below is another negative. 2 negatives give me a positive. Third, plugging 0.5 in above gives me a negative. Plugging that 0.5 in right here gives me a negative. Plugging 0.5 in here gives me a positive. And plugging 0.5 in here gives me a positive. Two positives and a negative yield a negative. Lastly, plugging the 2 in right here gives me a positive. 2 there gives me a positive. And 2 in my denominator gives me a positive, yielding 3 pluses and therefore a positive. Now, look at your original problem. It says we're looking for things that are less than or equal to 0. So I'm looking again for my negative answers. My positives don't work. That means, since I checked -2, that everything to the left of -1 and everything in between 0 and 1 will give me negatives. That would be negative infinity to -1 and 0 to 1 with a union in between them. I'm looking for my negatives. My negative infinity gives me parentheses. -1. If I were to plug -1 in up top there in the second parentheses, I'm going to get 0 in my numerator. That's okay. And I am less than or equal to 0. That's fine too. So I want a bracket. Plugging +1 in up at the top is fine too, because I get a 0 up top in my numerator. That's fine. I can use a bracket here. However, can I plug 0 into my denominator? No. 0 cannot be in my domain. Therefore, I would use a parenthesis. And you have now solved a rational function. One more before I finish for you tonight. Let's take a look at a rational function that requires a common denominator, such as x plus 2 divided by x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 1. Remember, I told you at the beginning that you have to set your functions greater than or less than or equal to 0. You need 0 on the right side of your function. So I have to move my 1. X plus 2 over x minus 4 minus 1 is greater than or equal to 0. But I've got 2 terms on the left side of my function now, and I only need 1. So I must find a common denominator, which is x minus 4. And what I do to my denominator, I must do to my numerator. So, write over a common denominator, x minus 4, and combine your numerator terms. X plus 2 minus x plus 4. My x's, after I've completed this step, cancel. X minus x is nothing, leaving 6 over x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 0. The zeros of my numerator are non-existent. I don't have a variable. I only have one 0 that I need to worry about, and that is 4. 4 will not be in my domain because 4 would give me 0 in my denominator, and I can't have that. I need to check something to the left and something to the right. Checking 3 in my numerator gives me a positive. 3 in my denominator gives me a negative. And a positive and a negative yield a negative. Putting 5 in my numerator gives me a positive. 5 in my denominator gives me a positive, and those 2 positives combine for another positive. Now, the original problem is asking for greater than or equal to 0. I'm looking for positives. So, things to the right of 4, like 5, will give me positives. So my solution set will be from 4 to infinity. Infinity gets the parentheses, and because 4 is not in my domain, I must use a parenthesis so that I am not including it. The areas where I get positives will be from 4, non-inclusive, to infinity. I hope this brief video has been helpful for those of you who are struggling. Have a good evening.